Hello, my name is Richard and I'm going to be reading from The Better Brown Stories. This is a book that I particularly enjoyed as a boy because it changes what you might expect from a novel. So the first chapter is called Hoovering. Here we are again in the peaceful and popular little town of Snuggleton-on-Sea. Things haven't changed much since we were here before. Its streets and alleyways, its cobbled lanes and coastal walks are just as they always were. The hotel and the bank, church, fire station and bingo hall all remain unchanged. Down at the harbour, a row of fishing boats bob, as always, at the quayside. Everywhere, from one end of the town to the other, there is the sound and smell of the sea. The people, too, are more or less unchanged. The cafe owner is cleaning his outside tables, paper boys and girls, the postman and the milkman are out on their regular rounds. The wet fishman is driving his van down to the harbour. The vicar is drinking tea. His cat is in the pear tree. Some mysterious men are messing about at the back of the supermarket, and the runner is getting ready for an early morning jog. Meanwhile, at number 38 Clifford Avenue, we find, as usual, our old friends, the Browns. It was 8 o'clock on a warm May morning. Mr. Brown was in the bathroom, singing the Hallelujah chorus. Mrs. Brown was in the kitchen, mixing homemade muesli and chopping bananas for breakfast. 10-year-old Betsy was brushing her hair while revising for a French test. 9-year-old Brian was watching an item on TV about Croft's dog show. Baby Brown was upstairs in his cot. The family gathered in the kitchen and sat down to breakfast. Mr. Brown mentioned a big financial deal he was handling at the bank. Betsy spoke enthusiastically of her French test, in which she was expecting to do well. Brian apologised for the state of his room and said he would tidy it up after school. Mrs. Brown nodded amiably but otherwise said little. She was looking forward to having the house to herself and getting on with a bit of hoovering. Silence. Immobility. Shock. Hang on a minute, Mrs. Brown lowered her spoon. What's all this? Looking forward to a bit of hoovering? A puzzled frown. I hate hoovering. I hate muesli, come to that, said Mr. Brown, staring perplexedly into his bowl. Me too, cried Brian. And I hate French, Betsy yelled. Silence again as the Browns considered their unusual situation. Mrs. Brown said, Who writes this rubbish? The writer, I suppose, said Mr. Brown. The baker bakes, the fisherman fishes, the teacher teaches. More or less, muttered Betsy. And the writer writes. Where does he live? One of those seaman cottages on Slope Street, I believe. Mrs. Brown rubbed her chin. Bit of hoovering. Let's go and see him. 20 minutes later, the Browns left the house. Brian and Betsy took turns with the pushchair. As they climbed the hill towards Slope Street, they were overtaken by the runner, returning from his run. His heavy breathing made Brian jump. The Browns were talking non-stop. And another thing, said Mr. Brown. Why do we have to have Auntie Marjorie to lunch every Sunday? And why is it we always cook vegetable casserole and plum pudding? Why is it always me that cooks it, Mrs. Brown added. I love plum pudding, said Brian. And a little later, why not more variety, less routine, more adventures, surprises, more pocket money, less homework, less housework, no housework, more dogs. Chapter 2. The Writer. Number 14 Slope Street was part of a terrace. It had small square windows either side of a lowish door. The door was painted red and had a brass knocker. Mrs. Brown knocked. A hush descended on the entire family. They were beginning to feel embarrassed. There was no answer. Mrs. Brown knocked again. Perhaps he's not up yet, said Mr. Brown. Well, he ought to be. It's 9 o'clock. Writers sometimes work till midnight, said Betsy. I read that somewhere. Yes, said Mrs. Brown, and a writer wrote it. Let's look around the back. But knocking on the back door brought no response either. Peering through the window, The Browns could see a table with the remains of breakfast. Toast, boiled egg, coffee cup, spread out upon a blue and white cloth. No muesli for him, muttered Mr. Brown. And he's got a dog, said Brian, spotting a kennel. A path led down to a remarkably long garden. The view was tremendous. Half the town and the entire curve of the bay was spread out below them. The garden itself was a picture. Flowers and bushes, trees and grass. To one side there was a rabbit hutch. A carousel of pegged-out washing fluttered near the house. At the far end, almost invisible in the trees, there was— "Look, Mum, a shed," cried Brian. "Writers work in sheds," said Betsy. "Sometimes." Mrs. Brown removed the baby from his pushchair, handed him to her husband, and continued down the path. The others followed. The shed was green. It had a door on the side, a sloping roof, and a row of windows at the front, one of which was open. Mrs. Brown looked in. A man was sitting at a desk looking out. He was slightly built, with brown hair, greying beard, and blue eyes. He was wearing a pair of gold-rimmed spectacles, peering over them, in fact, and had a pen in his hand. "Oh," cried Mr. Brown. "Goodness me," declared the man. Mrs. Brown was first to recover. "Excuse me, are you the writer?" Yes," said the man. "Well, our name's Brown. We'd like a word." "You've come to the right place, then," the man smiled. "There's loads of them here." He opened the door. "Did you say Brown?" "Yes," said Mr. Brown shyly. "Mr. and Mrs. Brian and Betsy," added the children. "What, from Clifford Avenue?" The man, the writer, that is, looked confused. Mrs. Brown nodded. "Good grief, you'd better come in." The shed contained, apart from the desk, a typist's chair, an easy chair, some shelves, an electric heater, and a tiny table with a kettle, cup, sugar bowl, and so on laid out on it. There was a rug on the floor, and photographs, posters, children's letters, page proofs, and newspaper cuttings on the wall. Mrs. Brown took a seat in the easy chair, with the baby on her lap. Brian and Betsy occupied the arms of the chair. Mr. Brown stood in the doorway. The writer swiveled to face them. "So, here we are. How can I—" "It's about the story we're in," said Mrs. Brown. "Oh yes, what seems to be— It's full of hoovering, and muesli, and French tests, and tidying my room. And another thing," this was Betsy, "all our names start with B. That's just silly." "Yes," said Brian, "and you're always saying how old we are, like 9-year-old Brian and that, and there's no dogs in this story anywhere." "As for the bank," said Mr. Brown mildly, "it's not the most exciting of places. Nor was the kitchen," added Mrs. Brown, "in which I mostly appear to live." She adjusted the baby on her lap. In a nutshell, you see, the thing about this story, it's boring." The writer was quite bowled over by this onslaught. The word that most upset him, of course, was boring. He removed his glasses and gazed out of the window. "This is a bombshell." Then, no one's ever complained before. And finally, "I've won prizes." The Browns shuffled uncomfortably. Brian began to read one of the posters. The baby hiccuped. Mr. Brown said, "It's not that we mean to hurt your feelings. It's just a different story," added Mrs. Brown. "That's all we want." The writer swiveled again to face them. His spirits, it seemed, were lifting. "A different story?" He drummed his fingers on the desk. 4 different stories. No muesli. Not long after, the Browns left in a hurry. Mr. Brown was late for work, the children for school, the baby for his clinic. All the same, Brian found time to visit the rabbits. There were 3 of them sitting out on a patch of the grass next to the hutch. Back in the shed, the writer made a cup of tea. He took a pile of paper and dropped it into the waste paper basket. He stared out at the view. Suddenly, once more a face stared in at him. "Sorry to bother." It was Mrs. Brown again, breathing hard. "I forgot there's one more thing." She opened the door and popped her head in. "It's hairdressers, perms, I hate 'em. Right, said the writer, I'll try to remember. And Mrs. Brown was gone. The writer sipped his tea. He watched the neighbour's cat come strolling up the path, listened to the distant surging waves down in the bay. Presently, he reached for a fresh sheet of paper and took up his pen. And that's all I'm going to read for today, but if you'd like to read the rest, you can find the Better Brown stories. As an activity for you to do, I'd like you to write the most boring story you can, and then try and rewrite it to make it the most interesting story you can. See how much better you can make it. If you'd like to watch more of the 100 Stories Deep series, you can click on the link in the description below. Thank you, and goodbye.